Dude, Daniel, you graduated from Princeton, got a 1580 on the SAT, also took the ACT, got a 36. You have worked with tons of students to help them with test prep through Educo. Like, how do you do this stuff? Also, you have everything, right? How do you do this stuff? Please tell me more about yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Daniel. It's wonderful to be here. I'm from Las Vegas, Nevada. I went to public high school. I think I worked hard in high school, which is how I got some of those scores. But at Princeton, I initially started in test prep, so I worked at these very big name test prep companies. And a couple years in, I figured I really didn't like the way that they operated. I felt like it was a very predatory market. And so a couple years back, I started my own business, and since then, we've worked with hundreds of students, helping them get to their score goals in a much more effective and an efficient way. Excited to be here to continue talking about it. And yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. Yeah, I'd love to have you here too. I think you know a whole lot about the process.
Mm.
You've been working on this for years, right? You've been working with students ever since the SAT was on paper, like with
Right, right.
dinosaurs around or whatever.
Right, right. Yeah.
So during the years, you've also seen probably test optional be something that popped up in 2020. So now that it's starting to like go away and schools are starting to require tests again,
Yeah.
like do you say test scores still matter?
Yeah. Well, I definitely think they do. And I think if you talk to anybody who got into an Ivy League or you talk with admissions officers, they'll likely agree. There's a reason that schools are shifting back towards tests. And I think it's not necessarily that it's an objective measure of your intelligence. I think the SAT is a much better gauge for how well you study the SAT as opposed to how well you studied in general or how prepared you are for college. But I do think it's the closest that colleges can get to objectively measuring somebody's preparation for college compared to something a bit more subjective like GPA. And so, yeah, I think it's very important for Ivy League admissions. It's not necessarily like you have to get a 1600, and I think a lot of people will agree with me on that to get into these Ivy Leagues, but it definitely has a range or a threshold that you'd want to hit to sort of eliminate any doubt that an admissions officer might have in your academic preparedness. I think the number is a lot more about the feeling that an admissions officer might get, I guess, if they look at that score and say like, it's sort of more about the underlying assumptions that come with that score. And so there's a big reason why MIT always has, their 25th percentile being an 800, et cetera. It's just the kind of assumptions that they can make about a student and their academics based off that score.
Right. So I mean, yeah, as you said, like there's a reason why test scores are even a thing, right? Like people say like college admissions are holistic all over the world except like the US or some other countries. It's
Yeah.
just test scores, like nothing else. So there's still a reason why test scores are a part of the US process, same as other countries.
Yeah, and I think it really helped in my particular case. I mean, I'm from Las Vegas, Nevada again, and the education system is not very great there. And so my GPA was insanely inflated. I think I took 24 AP classes. I ended with like a 6.5 or something crazy like that. So to a college, that means nothing because you can't compare Las Vegas education to something like in Massachusetts. And so it's a great way for myself. I think it was great for me to distinguish my intellect. I'll quote that because I don't actually think it is intellect, but in regards to college admissions.
So it's more like you'd say it's more like maybe leveling up the playing field, so everyone's like on the same plane with the SAT. I mean, it's a standardized test. Yeah. Yeah. So in the end, it's probably not only leveling up the playing field, right? It's probably some other reason as well that they actually require test scores. As you said, it's like a psychological thing to maybe assess the student. So why specifically do you think test scores are a requirement? It really isn't about the test.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what is it actually testing?
Yeah, it's very much a gauge for how well you study the SAT. I don't know. I think if anybody studied for the SAT, you'll note that it's not a very content-driven exam. So it's actually very surface level. The exam ends probably first semester of Algebra 2. And so it's not necessarily measuring if a student actually understood the content well. And I think a lot of the way that the US high school education curriculum is designed is more just like you memorize something and then you see it on the exam and you get it correct
It's
kind
kind
of
of
thing.
messed up.
Right. And so it's much more problem solving and like evaluating your thinking oriented. That's part of the big reason for that push for adaptive testing, where the questions are getting harder so that they can evaluate more accurately if a student is actually thinking in the way that they'd want to be thinking for Ivy League admissions. And so, yeah. And of course, again, it's not an objective measure of how well you problem solve. If you didn't score well on the SAT, it does not mean that you're not a great problem solver. it's more, I think, also a reflection of how well you studied what the College Board does to test problem solving. Like there are traps that they throw at you. There's very common, things they change in questions that are meant to throw you off and meant to really evaluate did that student actually understand the core concepts and the process behind that, as opposed to just memorize one way to do a question.
Mm, right.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, there's probably no objective way to actually analyze a student. This is probably like the closest. And
Closest
yeah,
way
I
we can.
mean, yeah, really depends on the student. There are some students that just know this like by heart and it just works. Like I've seen people just brute force it all the way. Like they don't know anything and they just push, push, push and getting a good score, end up getting a good score. And there's others that basically don't study and on their first try they get a really high score. As you said, it's basically just systems. And for some people, maybe if you know the system, and I'm gonna ask about it later, like you're not safe from that. But um, if you know the system, if for you it's simple. If you have a way to study, then what's actually the hardest part of the application apart from the test scores? Like you might
Yeah.
take a test, but there's a ton of other parts. I mean, you got into the Ivy League, right? So what would you say is the hardest part about college applications?
Yeah, well, I think I hear a lot of stories when I first consult with families about, like we have a friend who got a 1600 and they didn't get into any Ivy Leagues, things like that. And so it's definitely a case that happens. And I would note again, like test scores are important, but they're really not everything. They're likely the least important thing by the time you're in those final rounds of admissions where people are voting, whether the admissions officers are, evaluating whether or not you get in. And so I think at the end of the day, it's how your test score aligns with the rest of your application. Like the college admissions officers obviously are operating under a holistic system. They're looking at many factors. So if you have a high test score and you have nothing else like bad essays or maybe not necessarily bad extracurriculars, anything like that, but more like mediocre things that don't necessarily stand out, that's when you run into trouble and you can't rely on just a score to get you into that university. It comes much more down into like authenticity, how passionate you are in your extracurriculars. I think it's actually more like how you support what passions and motivations you're talking about in your essays, like what physical evidence you have of work in your community, work in your schools, etc., that sort of substantiate the claims that you're making in these essays. So that's one thing. And I also think it's how you connect those values, like how you connect your motivations, your perspectives, that sort of thing, in a way that fits with what that university wants. I think universities are very, very good at gauging the fit and the how well you fit into their communities. Like I have a sibling who he got into Penn, he went to Penn, absolutely loved it there, and he fits really, really well. We joke all the time, like if he had gotten into his dream school, which was Harvard, he wouldn't have fit in at all there. And I think it's the same my case for Princeton. I don't think I fit very well since I know the Penn community very well at this point. I don't think I would have fit very well in, but I think if I reflect on my unique perspectives and strengths and values, especially as a student, I do think I fit very well at Princeton. And so I think it's a matter of fit and it's a matter of authenticity and sort of something beyond just your extracurriculars and these scores, that sort of thing.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean that's also kind of what I've seen as well. Like test scores are kind of just like the first step, just for them to get them to see your application. But it's really just the other stuff, right? And probably well for you, you needed to find your extracurriculars, your narrative, the things that actually made you passionate. And how would you say you found those? Like I think for other students, it's really, really tough. And you probably found them one way or another. So maybe you can help them somehow with your system that you use to find something.
Yeah, and I know if I went back into, so to be fully transparent, I think I didn't do the best job of that. I do a much better job of helping students find their passions in my work now than when I was actually a high school student. But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much the cornerstone of what we do as college admissions consultants is helping students figure out what their passions are. And I think a lot of consultants get this wrong, especially those higher end, people are paying hundreds of $1,000s for consultants. I think they get it wrong because they push and they kind of force students into these areas of research or these extracurriculars, these businesses, et cetera, that just don't necessarily align with what the student actually wants. And that becomes very, very visible when you're looking at the essays, the interviews, the other components that are supposed to, again, substantiate the claims that you make in your extracurriculars and your essays. And so I would really go about it, again, authentically, I think is kind of the key word here, like making sure that you are genuinely passionate about, you have the right motivations behind what extracurriculars you pursue, regardless of what that is, regardless of if it aligns with your career or if it aligns with your academic interests. Because ultimately, to get to the level of achievement that a lot of these Ivy Leagues want, you need that genuine motivation. Like you need real motivation behind the causes that you're going for, like the types, even if a lot of students start businesses, etc. Like that's not something that's necessarily doable just by faking it. I mean, we get a lot of students who want to become doctors because their families are doctors and that sort of thing, right? And so we see time and time and again, especially when you look longer than high school and into undergrad and graduate school, kids who literally just cannot become doctors because their primary motivation is something extrinsic that is not enough to necessarily push them to a level of achievement that they might want. They
Mm.
need, I
And,
guess. Mhm.
yeah. And a lot of people try to fake it or force it. Like I've seen it a ton of times. I tried to do it myself at first. Like same stuff happened with me where, I wanted to become a doctor just because my granddad was a doctor and it just made sense. And it was like a generational thing. And it took me so much work to figure out that that's not really what I wanted to do. And I kind of knew it, like deep down. It's just that I didn't really want to admit it. So yeah. And what's crazy is that, yeah, you can't really fake it. Like you're an educational consultant, right? You probably had that sixth sense that you can feel the authenticity in someone when they speak or when they write something. But I mean, if you can tell, a lot of people can tell, admissions officers especially can tell. They read thousands every single day. Like, how will they not be able to smell your authenticity? And it's kind of insane. You just have to, there's no like concrete way to be authentic. You just have to, go with your
Yeah.
feelings sometimes, which is
Yeah.
kind of crazy.
Yeah, I totally agree. We've had students that we had a student last year that we admitted into Brown, and her extracurriculars, her stories had very, very little to do with what she initially came in doing. I think she was doing a lot of like cultural anthropology related work kind of thing, and she initially came to us like wanting to become a doctor or something like that. And it was a long journey, but eventually we really honed in on what her unique motivations were, and we crafted an application particularly around her genuine, authentic passions. And that's why I think that application worked. I think if you try too hard to focus on what you think college admissions officers will want to see, it's not going to end up very well. It's going to be very visible, as we just talked about, to sniff that out, basically, that that's not true.
Yeah, it's kind of overthinking. You have so many ideas like in your mind, it just doesn't work. Like you try it out, you try to force it too much. And that's kind of what it is. I feel like maybe it worked like a couple of years ago, but now that everyone's kind of forcing it, it went like the other way around where just being authentic and being weird and being quirky, it just works better than being a, academic machine or robot, which probably worked. Again, worked some time ago probably, but nowadays doesn't really work that much.
Yeah, and I think that's the beautiful thing about the job that we get to do, right? It's like it's at the core of it, it's helping a student figure out lifelong passions, right? Like what their actual time and work is like I think there's a concept of it being like the third pillar. It's like happiness, love, and work or something. It's very, very important. And so I think we have a great opportunity to really help students authentically find those passions. It's definitely a responsibility that I take very heavily.
Yeah, for sure. But sometimes the SAT or taking a test is not your passion, probably most of the time. And going back to that, like as you were saying, and as we've seen, like students that get good scores do things differently. At some point, you just can't brute force it. Like, yes, you can, but it's probably not ideal. So, what would you say specifically? And this is going back to the systems, right? What specifically is the system or the way that these people that actually get good scores
Yeah.
study? What do they do differently?
Yeah. Well, I totally agree with you. I think one point that I really want to put out there is like tutoring is I know I run a tutoring company, but it's a very optional thing. And I don't want students to go into this thinking like I have to sign up for tutoring to succeed on the SAT. The reason is because tutoring should be adjacent to what you're actually doing as a student when you're prepping for these exams. It comes in more as an analytical tool. So like to answer your question on kind of what the most important thing is, it's analysis. And that's what tutors do. It's not necessarily something you need a tutor to do, if that makes sense. I don't want to say it's simple, but it's doable on your own. And that's the make or break is essentially how well the student is able to take what practice they did, right? Say they took a practice exam, an ACT or an SAT, how well they're actually able to break down what kind of mistakes they made, where the patterns are, really dig deep into why they're making those mistakes, right? So I'm not talking like this is what I did and this was wrong and this was the second step in my math formula, whatever, but actually breaking down the thought processes of why the student didn't like this answer but did like this answer. All that kind of prompting is something that I think is really built into our tutoring systems that students have to do themselves with their self-studying. Is like they need to be good at prompting themselves to dig deeper, figure out what those root causes are, and then figure out the strategies and the concepts around that. And I think a lot of test prep companies focus way too heavily on the content. They just push all this like videos and blogs and questions on something. And again, it's not really a content driven exam. And so you could spend hundreds of hours doing Khan Academy or these big systems and you get very little out of it if you're not actually doing that individualized, that personalized reflection and analysis into your own thought process and coming up with strategies that are tailored to those exact errors, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And you said Khan Academy, like maybe it's not enough for that like deep understanding of the topics. So what would be the best resources?
Yeah, I don't want to trash Khan Academy. I think it's a fantastic resource. And I think if anybody's out there considering buying a prep system, it doesn't really make sense to not just use Khan Academy. And so I think it's a fantastic resource. But yeah, I think the best prep resource would be on, this is kind of a cop-out answer, but it is honestly the student themselves and their analysis, right? And that's the thing that I think most students who self-study struggle with. Like if you are stagnating, your score is not going up at all, you've been putting on all these hours to test prep, your main culprit is how well you're actually analyzing that exam, how closely you're documenting it. It's also, I would note, like how frequently you're coming back to that documentation. Like we have a lot of kids who write down these formulas and strategies and all these great realizations they're making, and then they just lose it in a week because they're not actually coming back in, spaced repetition, like coming back to it every couple days to really retain it. So that I would also note on the actual to like literally answer your question, a lot of it should come from College Board. I think the official resources are more than enough. There's a lot of really bad third-party material out there. And I know because I've been on the content end, like I've worked to make questions for companies. And I know their processes aren't good because why am I even in a position to be making questions for students when I'm a tutor, right? Like I don't work at College, but I don't have actual expertise behind it. And that's just the way a lot of these companies operate. And I think what that ends up doing is it produces a lot of very weak prep material that students are wasting time using. And so you really want to stick with the official SAT and the official College Board resources, like the question bank for the SAT, the 7 practice exams, 2 PSATs, all that sort of stuff. We use a lot of the old SAT material for the math because it's very, very relevant today, et cetera. And we do source a lot of new materials abroad that are very, very accurate, et cetera. You want to stick with what the College Board has made essentially instead of finding some other system, if that makes sense.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. You made me remember something. So there's
Yeah.
a teacher that I had in high school, a math teacher, and they focus, and this was in 12th grade, like I'm not kidding. And the first class was him asking us, like, what the angle, like the total angle sum of a triangle was.
Yeah.
Like we all know it's like 180, right? We know this by heart. And the whole class was him asking why. He wanted us to figure out by ourselves why it was 180.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had no idea, right?
Yeah.
Nobody knew. And it was
Yeah.
something that was so obvious for all of us, and nobody knew the answer. So eventually, when we ended up like discovering it all together, like the 30 of us in my class, like it was like a big relief and also an eye opener where we noticed like, damn, we actually don't know anything. And I think that may be a little bit of what you're talking about. He was all in on understand the why of everything. If you understand why you're doing it, then when I show you an exercise or a practice question that you've never seen before, you will know how to answer because you'll know the logics behind it, right? Is that like a little bit of what you're talking about, right?
That makes perfect sense. Yeah. And I think that aligns with my point that the quantity of material isn't really that important. I make a point to all the students we work with that in college, you're not going to get an exam where there's like a whole software designed around that exam. Like you're not going to get a Khan Academy for that specific course, right? And so it really, this is a fantastic opportunity. I think that's kind of what I love about test prep is it's the first opportunity for a lot of students to really learn how to study effectively, and studying effectively includes that process of breaking down, understanding the whys, digging deep essentially. And that's really the key, I think, to good test prep, to effective studying for anything. Even in life, I guess you want to think about what your reasons are behind problems you've had, and then you can come up with good solutions after you've analyzed that.
Now, you still need to do practice tests and still to do questions and a lot of exercising, a lot of work. It's still, studying, right? So as for the timelines, you get like the SAT 7 times a year or whatever, like you get it a bunch of times. But
Yeah.
how much of a difference does it do if you study for 2 months, 6 months, 1 year? Like the timeline difference, like how big is it? Like,
Yeah, it does definitely make a difference. I think the thing about how we operate at Educo is we're very efficiency focused. Like, we don't really focus as much on like billable tutoring hours or like, I think a lot of companies focus on just really lengthening the line of tutoring to make sure that obviously they make the most money out of it. So I think when it comes to like the most objective answer to that, it's one, you probably shouldn't be studying that long for the SAT because again, it's really not that deep of an exam. And I know that's biased on my end because I've taken it and I've done well on it, but I genuinely do think there is a very much more effective way to do it. So the way that we operate at Educo is very efficiency focused. We don't actually ever encourage a student to test that long. We treat every student like they have a month to get their score kind of thing and essentially make a plan around getting it the first go kind of idea. What that actually looks like though, and I think this is kind of the answer to your question about like, if you have 2 months to study, what should I do? Again, it comes down to structure and efficiency. I think you want to make sure that the resources that you're using are really, really high quality, right? And you're focusing on the right resources. You're not wasting time on resources or just anything in general, like, I don't know, doing a bunch of practice exams back to back without doing much analysis between them. You're not wasting on processes that cost time and don't actually influence the score. So a very targeted approach is very important. That's a big job of tutoring. And I think that's why, and again, I don't want to make it seem like tutoring is a requirement. I think it's very much a luxury, something that you add in addition to your studying. But that's a huge part of tutoring is structuring, like telling students exactly what the most high yield use of their time would be, what's actually going to get them a lot of score growth from that single use. And so that would be something I'd encourage. I think the problem with 6 months to a year is students tend to burn out and they tend to forget things. And the retention is really, really important. We get that a lot. Like we work with sophomores and freshmen who are prepping for their senior or junior, sophomore year exams, etc. And what's ended up happening, they learn something and then they just totally forget it by the time they need to use it. Score never goes up, they burn out kind of idea. And so I would really discourage people from testing longer than like a 2-3 month span. I think test prep, the sweet spot is around 8 to 12 weeks before you take your test date. And then you can test again if you need to. And you likely know this as an admissions consultant yourself. There's no problem in testing multiple times. Like you get a bad score, who cares? Nobody's going to see. I think the only university that's notable at this point is Georgetown, likely, that requires all scores. And so nobody else will care. Just take the exam, right? Just make sure that you're not lengthening, like nobody's lengthening their timeline because they're scared to test or that they don't want to test, etc. And I wouldn't start until you're really ready to commit in a very semi-aggressive, but you're essentially ready to commit to the test prep in the coming weeks instead of just like doing it one day and then leaving 6 days without any test prep.
Yeah, I mean, I remember I took the SAT 7 times before getting a 1520, right? Like, I'm the prime example of this. Eventually, I got it. Took me a long time to figure it out. But yeah, I mean, it took me a lot of tries. And also, I want to ask you a question regarding this.
Yeah.
So I did retake it because I didn't have enough of a high score as I wanted. But
Okay.
let's say a student gets like a 1550. Do they need to retake?
Probably not. And then it makes more sense to focus on their extracurriculars and their application narratives, whatever. So definitely not. I think the only extenuating circumstance is schools like Caltech and MIT. Harvard looks for very high reading scores, etc. Especially MIT though, which is a dream school for a lot of students. An 800 math is very much ideal. And so that would be the only case.
Is overstudying a thing?
No, I definitely think it is. We meet a lot of students initially who are studying like 3-4 hours a day and getting very little results. And I think that's the biggest contributor to burnout on the SAT is students spending all this time studying and then they're not getting the results they want. They come out of it disappointed, don't want to study again kind of idea. And so you can definitely overstudy on the wrong resources. And again, the key comes down to targeting, really understanding what errors you're missing and also what kind of strategies will specifically fix that error is where you should study. And eventually eventually you'll sort of be able to really maximize the efficiency in session. Again, it's roughly 30 minutes to an hour a day, maybe 2.5 on weekends. I really think is all you need to contribute to test prep. Anything more is definitely overkill and very unnecessary for the score.
What's an actionable step or actionable advice that you would give students to actually focus on the right things and not waste any time?
Yeah, so we start everything from a diagnostic exam, and I think that's exactly where students should start as well, is take a diagnostic, whatever exam you have available to you, and determine from there what your next steps are. The way that we structure at Educo is every week we have students test, and weekly testing I think is extremely important because the actual plan, what you're doing between the tests, should be totally educated and populated by the analysis that you're doing from that weekly exam. So testing in quick succession, making sure that you're constantly re-seeing questions, etc., and giving, I guess, your brain time to process the patterns that you're seeing in exams, etc., very important. And so take a diagnostic, do that analysis, right? Figure out exactly where you're going wrong in your thought process. And then from that, determine the right strategies and the right structure to get to fix those gaps, essentially. That's where students who self-study have to be very resourceful, right? They have to do a lot of research. They have to do a lot of vetting around what strategies they're actually taking in before they actually commit to a strategy. I think, again, lots of bad strategies. We see even on Khan Academy, there are some strategies where like, oh, I really wouldn't do that because there are questions where that wouldn't work kind of idea. So you have to vet the strategies. You have to be resourceful when you're figuring out this actual solution. Once you do that, though, the rest of the study plan comes in based on your initial analysis. So it's diagnostic, it's analysis, and then creating the study plan from there. The study plan from there is different for every student, so I have no solid answer for you there. For most students, it includes a couple, maybe 2 to 3 days of follow-up of content, whatever questions they had that they genuinely didn't know the formulas behind, or they need to review certain concepts. That's when you'd need that. And then there's a couple days where you should focus on practice. You likely know this about the SAT already, but it's a very exposure-based exam. If you do a lot of SAT math, you're just going to get a higher score. And so there's a very high correlation there. You'd want to focus on seeing different iterations of the questions you're missing to prep, basically. Do I understand the underlying concept, or did I just memorize one way to do one question? And if it changes, I'm not going to be able to get it right kind of idea. So you'd want to do both of those before reviewing, taking your next exam, and the cycle repeats.
I mean, that's perfect. That's probably a system that literally everyone can just copy for themselves. And yes, you do need to find out like your specific way of studying. Probably people just look for YouTube videos, get tons of different strategies or techniques or frameworks, and they just keep switching from strategy to strategy and keep trying and probably don't see any progress. So I actually think it's kind of more like sticking to one thing and maybe trusting the process a little bit. Like you need to trust that maybe eventually you're going to get stuck, but you're going to push through that, right? And eventually you're actually going to start improving. But you're never going to improve if you just keep changing your frameworks and your systems that you're studying, right?
Yeah, and I think it is very important that you stick to one thing, and that especially the strategy that I think it's important you pick a strategy that's based on research and based on data, right? Like we have a very good hold on what strategies actually work on the exam. Not necessarily sure, and I don't want to badmouth anybody in particular, but on Reddit and YouTube, etc., I think there are a lot of strategies, again, that we're very iffy about. And so you'd want to make sure that the source the strategy is coming from is good, but agree with you don't want to switch too quickly. That applies mostly to the ACT as well. Like ACT reading has so many different ways to approach it. If you constantly switch strategies, you are not able to get your reading score. It's like trying to run a mile in the first 6 minutes the first time you start running, right? Like you need to give yourself time to acclimate and really make sure that you understand the ins and outs of that strategy before deciding, should I continue with this or skip and do some other thing. So totally agree.
Mm-hmm. At the same time, as you probably know, like it doesn't mean that you don't need to take any advice, but you really have to analyze it before, like, and think about it like at least 4 times to make sure that you can implement it and it won't mess up your entire system. Because at the end, like, it's kind of fun. It's really fun actually to just figure out other things and try new methods and the Pomodoro and whatever. Like, it's kind of fun to see new things, and it's boring to do the same thing over and over again. But to actually see progress, you need to do the same thing over and over again.
Right. Yeah, got to do the hard work, which includes the review thing. I think that's something we always tell students to do. We have to sort of force it in when we tutor because it is not a fun thing to really document and study, that kind of stuff. But it's extremely important for results.
If we went back in time, and this is completely unrelated to their stuff.
Yeah.
If we went back in time and you could apply again to college. Let's say you're in freshman year, again, so from the start,
Yeah.
without knowing you're going to get into Princeton or the Ivy League, but with all the knowledge that you have right now. What would you do differently? How would you prepare?
Right. So, a couple things I want to mention here. The first is again what we talked about with the passions and the what you're spending your time in with extracurriculars. I feel like I spent way too much time just doing what I felt like colleges would care about, when in reality that's actually kind of a backward system. It doesn't really help very much. And so things like school clubs, just because you want to impress a college, or even like taking on some random research project because you feel like it would be helpful, I think is an absolute waste of time. I would focus on really identifying what my genuine passions are early on. I think I have passions for entrepreneurship and things that I feel like I should have taken advantage of in high school instead of narrowing so heavily. I narrowed in on public health, was like my little niche that I felt like, honestly, well, it kind of worked, but I narrowed in on it, and I didn't necessarily have as much passion for it as what I know now are more passionate. So yeah, I would try things. I would figure out those passions. You can only figure them out by trying, and give myself, I think, that space to do it. I think I didn't because I was so concerned about what's going to get me into Harvard or Princeton sort of thing. And so I just sort of rejected opportunities that in reality likely would have helped with my results, I guess. But yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's still a long process. You made it anyways, right? At the end of the day, yes, you could have changed stuff. Maybe you
Yeah.
would have had way more fun during high school. And I think that probably may have given you, higher chances. You probably would have gotten in anyways and having more fun, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of students, this is so easy again for me and you to say, but I think it's easy to overcomplicate the admissions process or to overstress about it. I remember being extremely anxious my junior and senior year, just thinking about applying to college. It was like the only thing I thought about for several years. And so I know this is easy for me to say, but I really don't think it's that big. It's as big of a deal as people likely make it out to be. Like I look at a lot of my peers at these Ivy Leagues. I look at a lot of the friends that I had in high school who ended up going to our state universities, etc. They have the same jobs, right? And so I think the Ivy League image of like these kids are so successful is simply because the student themselves was likely bound to be successful in the first place. Like they had those kind of qualities that help, or maybe they're well connected, but a lot of them have good qualities, etc. And that's why they're at that university. Just because a student isn't at an Ivy League does not necessarily mean that they aren't qualified or that they don't have the same intellect, or you get what I mean. I think it doesn't necessarily matter. It's more like that correlation without causation thing when it comes to the Ivy League. And so, yeah.
Daniel, thank you for being here.
Of
I
course.
think a lot of students will resonate with your story. It was really, really nice to have you here. I think
Yeah.
we got a ton of like liquid gold information in here that I think it's really, really applicable for basically everyone in high school all over
Yeah.
the world, not only in the US. Like if you're international, you still have to take the SAT, right? Nothing to do about it. But yeah, thank you for being here. I actually think this is extremely useful.
Of course. And that really is the core mission of what we're doing at Educo. I mean, it's very value focused. We want to make sure these resources are accessible. The underlying tagline is quality education more accessible. And so if you have any additional questions, to those of you watching, you're welcome to reach out to me directly, visit our website for more information. And yeah, thanks for having me.
And I was just about to ask, if someone wants to connect directly with you, where can they find you?
Yeah, you're welcome to email me directly. It's daniel@learneduco.com. If you want to learn a little bit more about our test prep process, our results, that sort of thing, you're welcome to visit learneduco.com as well. And yeah, I'd love to speak, love to figure out the right plan to get you to your score. And yeah, thanks for having me again.
Awesome. If you want to directly meet people like Daniel, so ambitious students, Ivy League mentors, or admissions experts that are actually doing this, we'd love to talk with you. At College Connect, we're not just helping students get in, we're building a network of future leaders. This is the kind of community that I wish I had during high school, where you can actually meet the people that will open doors for you before you even get to college. So if you're from the US or applying internationally and want to know how it works, or just ask any questions, you can book a one-on-one call with us completely for free. We'll meet with you, walk through your goals, and help you figure out your best strategy. You can find the link to book in the description or the pinned comment. We'd love to meet you.